You are listening to Within Tolerance, a podcast for machinists by a machinist. I'm your host, Dylan Jackson of Proteum Machining, and this week I am happy to welcome back Zach Tong. Welcome, Zach.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. So for anybody who hasn't heard your first episode, who are you? What do you do? Real quick.
Sure. So I'm breaking taps on the internet. So YouTube channel, Instagram, Twitter, pretty much everywhere. And basically, people probably know me from the YouTube channel. I went full-time YouTube and other related things about 2 years ago now, I want to say. And so I've just been, working in my shop, making videos and then doing stuff kind of behind the scenes. The channel itself, if you haven't seen it, it's a weird mix of things, but it's basically like a little bit of machining, a little bit of microfabrication, a lot of like microscope work, and mostly just whatever catches my interest because I don't know, I get kind of all over the place. So it tends to kind of meander around between different topics.
Awesome. Yeah. And for anybody who hasn't listened to it, head on back, episode 134. We go into his whole backstory and stuff. So let's do an update. You have kind of acquired a lot of things and changed your whole workflow and lots of different videos since then. So, what have you been doing?
Yeah. Well, first, I want to apologize for the last one. I was super nervous to be on the podcast. I don't know if that came through or not, but I was very imposter syndrome feeling, but I actually felt like an imposter because I didn't know what I was talking about for machining. So I don't know if I gave great answers last time, but
I thought it was a great episode. I really enjoyed. It's always nice to talk to somebody who's discovering your trade and, hearing that new viewpoint. Like, I didn't invite you on expecting you to be the master machinist. I invited you on because you were doing some really cool stuff I'd never seen. Your high-speed video, I think, was my intro to your channel. And just seeing chatter at a high speed and actually seeing what's going on with an end mill was really, really mind-blowing for me. So, yeah, no imposter syndrome feeling needed at all.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, I remember I got on. I'm like, oh man, I don't know what I'm talking about with machining. I'm just this like joker on YouTube. He's not even a good machinist on YouTube. It's kind of funny. Right. So updates. I think last time when we talked, I had just moved into the barn, I think, if I recall.
So I think you were still there and you were looking for a new place.
Looking for a new place?
Yeah, I don't know if you mentioned it on the episode, but I think afterwards we were talking and you were like, yeah, I need to get out of the murder barn.
Yeah. So I was in a murder barn for everyone that doesn't know. There was a room inside the barn. I guess not a lot of people actually know why it is called the murder barn. So there's a room that was previously used by mushroom growers, like the fancy kind that you sell at a restaurant, not like the fun kind at Bonnaroo. And they had put white plastic sheeting all over for the incubation chamber to like keep it more sterile. And I moved into the barn. I'm like, I'll just keep it up because I was feeling kind of lazy and it was cleaner than the barn itself. So I just left it, but it had very like Dexter vibes. So that was the murder barn.
So a real quick aside about that, speaking of mushroom growers. So everyone who listens to this podcast would know that I'm looking for a new shop space. And finding a place with power and room and all of that has been incredibly hard. Well, I was talking to a friend who's an old customer, or he left one of my old customers. He was an engineer there, and his new venture is growing mushrooms. That's what him and his friend do, is they grow nice mushrooms for restaurants and things like that. And we're talking, and he goes, "Oh yeah, we just moved into a place. It's like 5,000 square feet, has 400 amps of 480 and 400 amps of 208, and we just don't use any of it." And I was like, steam was coming out of my ears. I was like, you got to be kidding.
As you've been looking for a place for like a year now.
Yeah, exactly.
Terrible. Yeah, it's funny actually, as another sidebar. When I was looking for the current place I'm in, I visited a unit that was right next to fungus people after they moved out. And it was the same situation. They moved in this beautiful new place. It was like several thousand square feet, really nice industrial location. I'm like, man, I'm in the wrong business. I need to be like growing portobellos.
Yeah, exactly.
So I was up in this barn and I don't want to say it was a mistake to move up there, but it was kind of a mistake. I needed to get out of my garage at the time, and I wanted a place that had a little better power situation and just mainly had more space. And it technically fulfilled those, but it was a sketchy barn. The concrete was really unlevel. Like the roof leaked, had very bad heating in the winter. So it was one of those things. I got all my stuff moved up in there and started working there. I was like, man, this was a big waste of time. I need to start looking for a new place. So I moved into my current shop, I don't know, maybe like 6 or 8 months after that. Uh, got kind of lucky. There's not a lot of industrial space around here, which I'm sure you can feel the pain of as well. And
Certainly.
especially like small industrial space, right? There's plenty of 20,000 foot, warehouse spaces, but I needed 1,200,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
20,000.
I was just talking to Easton yesterday because there's one in town that I wish I could justify. Like, I wish I was big enough. It's 13,000 square feet and has 4,000 amps of
Oh,
three
it's
phase,
so great.
and it's all AC. And, so I was like, oh
Oh,
man, that would be,
please.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, just like running the numbers. What can we sell to make this make sense?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I moved down here and moved all my junk. And let's see, I had the office mill at the time. I think I mentioned that on the last episode. And then once I got here, picked up the med center. So I have a Kitamura Med Center now. I don't know, maybe like 3 or 4 months after I moved. And that was one of the other reasons I wanted to move was there's three phase here and there wasn't up at the last place. And so that was a pretty big driving factor. Plus, I mean, the thought of putting like a nice precision piece of equipment into an old dairy barn just seemed kind of wrong anyway.
Yeah, that,
um,
that or running it off of a rotary phase converter
yeah,
or something. It's like,
yeah,
bleh.
exactly. And just other kind of less tangible things. Like I wanted a place that you could take a picture of and like, hey, this looks like a real shop rather than a sketchy barn. Both for YouTube purposes and also just for like job shop work or a website or whatever. So yeah, I've been here, I guess, about a year now. I moved in last winter, I want to say, year and change, something like that. And yeah, it's been going pretty well.
That's awesome. Well, maybe we should get into the med center. We had a few people asking about, why'd you buy it? Why a med center? How you liking it? All of that stuff. So, let's start at the top of it. Why a med center? And how did you
Yeah.
find the med center and choose that one?
Ooh. Yeah. So Med Center, I took some notes because I didn't want to forget things. It probably feels like a strange purchase for a person that makes YouTube videos. I think is probably the first thing people think of when they see maybe like my Instagram or YouTube. And then they're like, why does this guy have a med center? A Haas office mill kind of makes sense, or even like a VM2 or whatever. But the med center does seem kind of like a curious choice. Uh, so when I went full time YouTube back in the day, the business plan essentially was making videos when I wasn't busy with consulting and client work and then doing consulting client work on the side, and then basically just swapping between them as time allowed. And the general idea was like, I'll make videos about things that I'm interested in or might be like interesting techniques. And then that can help drive traffic to the consultancy or contract work. And that worked pretty well. Like in the beginning, it was very much more focused on microscope stuff, like analysis through the scanning electron microscope or, any of my other kind of inspection tools, and a little bit of microfab work using the laser generally, but also some like the lithography things. And that was a decent plan. And it did actually, it's kind of surprising how often you'll put up a video about, I don't know, micromachining silicon wafers with a laser. And you start getting a lot of questions from people be like, hey, can you do this thing for me? Sometimes it's like university students that don't have the facilities at their university, or it's like small startups that maybe want to try a thing but don't want to purchase the equipment for it, or need to like get a feature inspected on the SEM but can't justify it.
Yeah, I imagine
Um,
there's not a lot of job shops that cater to that kind of like microfab stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And so that was my original thought. I'm like, okay, this is a good niche to be in. And it probably is, but it's also a very small niche because it's one of those things that like if you're a startup and you're relying on micro features, there's a very limited window of time where you're going to outsource that before you just go buy the equipment. Because if it's critical to what you're doing, it's critical and you're just going to get the equipment yourself. Or you're a university and you probably have the equipment somewhere that you can access. So I started to kind of like branch out, and that's when I picked up the office mill because I figured like, well, it's had some like macro scale stuff, so micro machining metal stuff. It seemed like a safer plan to do job shop work, like not an easy plan by any means, but like, there was a playbook there of get, print, make part, send it back, get money.
Right. And that's kind of geared towards that smaller work envelope stuff because that's what, a 20,000 RPM spindle?
It's a 30.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's a real baby spindle, so you don't like want to go above a quarter-inch end mill, or else you'll blow up your spindle belt like I did. But but yeah, it's 30,000 RPM, and it's got, I don't know, finer pitch ball screws, so it has a little more precise motion and stuff like that. So ostensibly, it's a micro machining, like a baby's first micro machining platform. And so that was the plan with that. And I would say generally it was the right idea, but maybe the wrong machine for it. Like if I'd picked up the new CM, the compact mill, I think is what they're calling it, that probably would have worked a little better. But I was being cheap. I bought 2006 office mill that had who knows what kind of history behind it. It had a lot of maintenance problems when I first got it. And it just, I don't know, there was a lot of things that probably weren't executed quite correctly with picking up that particular machine. And so that's all just a long way of saying, like, when I went shopping for the next machine, I wanted something that I didn't have to worry about the machine so much. Like a modern machine that had the bells and whistles, linear scales. I went 5-axis because in my head at the time, I was still like, okay, I'm juggling YouTube channel stuff with job shop stuff. And then also I want to do some like prototyping of my things in the background. And so all the time spent on setups and fixturing and all that stuff was time that I wasn't spending on videos. And so like it's direct trade-off. And if I spend a whole month working on client work, then that's none on the channel side. So at least in my head at the time, I'm like, okay, let's get 5-axis. You don't have to do any setups. It's easy peasy, right? You just hit the go button in Fusion and get paths and make a part. Clearly, it's not not quite that simple, as I've learned. But that's largely where my head was at the time. And so once I decided, okay, I want like a good precision 5-axis. Like, what are the options, and what are the options that can fit in my new shop, which is relatively small. And the Kitamura was just a pretty good sweet spot in all those different criteria. Like it's a pretty affordable machine for what it is. It's very small, like compact footprint, that is. And it's in its work envelope, it's a very accurate machine.
What else was in the running that you were looking at?
So I probably didn't do enough homework. I don't know. Sometimes you get like a machine in your head and you're like, I want this machine. And so there's definitely was some of that. But I was looking at the Hermle lineup, but they're just so big, like physically big.
Oh, yeah. You could fit almost 2 med centers into even a C250 size.
Yeah, exactly. And then also I had in my head, like the, I don't know, 2-3 year plan was like, okay, we'll add automation onto it next. And the automation for the Hermles are just equally enormous from what I recall. Yeah. And so that made it tough. And I had heard things, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I heard that their grease pack spindles weren't super happy with running at max RPM like all the time, which is probably true for any grease spindle. But right.
Yeah,
I knew I was going to be doing a lot of small like surfacing stuff, and I didn't really want to deal with that. So that was one option. I looked at the Chiron. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Chiron, I think.
I think, yeah.
Sure, we'll go with that.
I know. Yeah, I struggle with it too. But so they have a small 5-axis?
Yeah, it's like the FZ08 something. And it's a pretty compact machine as well, but has a little bit larger work volume than Med Center. A lot of similar specs otherwise. You can get a high-speed spindle, encoders, the whole works. It was much more expensive, and support in the US, at least on the East Coast, seems pretty sparse. Like I think the main place was down in like North Carolina, and that was it.
Yeah, I saw them in Smarter Everyday's video when he went through, I think, Edelbrock, the carburetor manufacturer. They had a bunch of their pallet changers, like verticals.
Oh, cool. I didn't notice that.
Yeah, but besides that, I don't know that I've really talked to anybody who runs them in the US.
Yeah. And that's kind of the gist too. Once I get talking to the guy, he's like, yeah, we don't really sell these to individual shops, like unless you're a car maker or some like big automation place or something. Like he was very friendly in giving me the details, but you could also get a sense of like, these aren't going into job shops. I'm talking to the wrong manufacturer here.
Yeah, sounds like a big red flag for sure.
Yeah. I looked at Kern for a hot minute and then nope, right out of it. Just not at all in the price range. I did look at the Haas stuff, and if I hadn't heard like the horror stories from Nick and others, I might have considered it more strongly. But after hearing about it, I just like, I don't know if I want that in my life at this point. I did look at the Chinese, was it Jingdao, I want to say. I briefly talked to the sales guy, and I have really mixed feelings about it. Like on one hand, the machine actually looks not too terrible for what it is, and the price is pretty reasonable, but it had just some big red flags. Like Well, so on the plus side, they have extensive thermal system and all the axes are actually actively cooled, which is interesting. Like
Oh wow.
not on the med center by any means. A lot of like really interesting things for a good high speed spindle, but it was stuck at like 15 tools max, no extensions.
It's bizarre.
They have their own cam system that you use, don't support other stuff. Like it very much felt like a machine that was probably really good to stick in a factory and have 100 of them doing the same part over and over. I'm like, okay, we're not going to do this. On top of also the support issue, I think those were the major ones I was looking at. I'm trying to remember if there are any others, but I don't know. I kind of had my eye in the med center at some point. I was like, okay, I think this might be the one, and it ended up being the one. So
awesome. Well, how was the process getting it spun up and familiarizing yourself with a new control and machine and workflow? And, there was a lot that you were kind of stepping into.
Yeah. It's been a learning curve. Getting it initially installed was interesting. So I'd say the folks that installed it, they were great. No problems at all with the dealer. The main issue immediately was it got dropped off and the installation tech showed up, started working on it, and we realized I just didn't have enough air for it. So the spec, I forget what it is. They say it's like 8 CFM or something. And the poor technician was starting to install it and he's like, it keeps airing out on me because doesn't have enough air. Like, I don't understand why. My compressor's like rated for 12. We added another little piston compressor just to like help it out, so we're up to like 16 or 17 and it's still alarming out. As it turns out, the Kitamura needs like 23 CFM if I recall correctly, once all the things are going. So that was,
even our kitty was like that too. I mean, it just was basically a massive air leak. I could have used probably the same amount of air by just cracking a nozzle at that end of the shaft. Like it was, our compressor ran almost all day if we were running that machine.
Yeah.
And then, we went to the brothers and it was like, oh, these use almost no air.
Oh yeah, they're like 2 or 3 CFM, right?
Yeah,
they're super.
exactly.
It's basically non-existent.
Yeah, because you have an air oil spindle, so it's using that, and then spindle purge, and I'm sure a tool changer uses some somewhere. So there's all.
And the axes are all purged as well, or the scales on the axes have air purge.
Oh right, right.
And so I also got the laser tool setter, and it uses itself like 2 or 3 CFM. It's stupid how much air it uses. So we had that like dialed down as low as it could possibly go, and it just wasn't working. So just to finish the installation, I ran out to Home Depot and bought another compressor. It was like a 6 or something CFM, kind of like the biggest small compressor that I could fit in my car, because they couldn't do deliveries because deliveries were backed up for like 2 years or whatever. So they couldn't even drop off a big one if I wanted it. So we had a scroll compressor, a quote unquote quiet piston compressor, and then a not quiet piston compressor all running at the same time just to get enough air to like finish the installation. Because the guy lived down in Massachusetts, and so you'd have to come back up another week to finish and install. So that was fun. We also didn't have the right oil. So it was a showroom model originally, and it was all, plumbed up for the showroom, but they had to drain a bunch of the fluids to move it up here. And I don't know if like I didn't think to ask about it or if they forgot about it, but it didn't have any oil for the spindle chiller. And so we needed a very particular type of oil, which no one carries in the state of Vermont, apparently. And it was quite a struggle to find it. So the guys installing it, I found some place, but it was like 3 hours away. So I drove out to this like random oil depot in the middle of like northern Vermont while the guy's back at my shop installing, and then drove back with my 5-gallon pail. It was a bit of an adventure, but he was a good sport about it.
That's crazy.
But once we got it installed, like it's been pretty smooth sailing. So I know there's a question about like what cam I'm using. So I'm using Fusion 360, and I don't think there's actually a post for it. There's a generic Mitsubishi post, but I haven't tried it because I've been too scared to try it, to be honest. But the machine comes with a year of Camplete for free. So I've been just basically posting from Fusion to Camplete, run all my simulations, and then that generates the code for me, which has worked out pretty well. Camplete's I don't know, it's a thing. We can talk about that later if we want, but have feelings about Camplete, but it works from a posting perspective.
Yeah. It seems like, because I've thought the same thing, like when we buy a 5-axis, it's like, oh man, do I trust standard post? Like,
Yeah.
that's a lot of trust in a freebie.
It really is. Yeah.
Yeah. And so even just for having a dialed post processor, it seems like the cost of Camplete is not crazy. I mean, it's
Yeah,
not
it's not too
cheap,
bad. It's
but
come down in price, I think, too. I mean, we'll see when it comes up for renewal, but I think it's 3 or 4,000 nowadays, which
right.
could be worse.
Yeah. I mean, I think you pay easily that, if not double or triple that from any of the other cam systems for a true post. So
Yeah. One thing I am looking into, I probably will have the folks at DSI make me a post because Camplete doesn't really do probing at all. And so, like, you can't do in process inspection of stuff and, adjusting cutter comp and all that sort of thing. Like, Camplete just doesn't do it really at all, which is a huge pain. So, I probably will get one for Fusion just so I can do that sort of thing on a program that I've already proved out after running it through Camplete. But
yeah, that's super frustrating. I don't know why probing seems to be such a bugaboo for so many, because even in like Fusion itself, you run a probing operation and it detects it as a collision every time. And so you
yeah,
just end up ignoring these collisions every time. It's
yeah,
frustrating.
it is, especially when like you don't really want to be ignoring collisions.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
that's
I just want to look for red and then
yeah,
post, but it's like, well, I got to ignore the first 2 reds every time, or 3, or, however many
yep.
probing things I'm doing. It's like, oh, great. Okay, cool.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I'd have to say from like a workflow perspective, toolpaths and all that stuff, like it's been a huge learning curve, but major props to Fusion for being, I mean, almost idiot proof when it comes to getting involved with 5-axis. I've learned there's a lot of difference between a 5-axis path and a good 5-axis path. Like there's definitely a lot of nuance there. But Fusion, I mean, I hit the ground with essentially zero 5-axis understanding and was making toolpaths within the first week, which did what they were supposed to do and made a part. So yeah, Fusion definitely makes that a lot easier than probably other systems could make it. I've heard some horror stories about different cam systems. Uh, Now, getting a good path is a challenge that I'm still working on, depending. And some
Yeah.
of that is down to also just the machine itself has some interesting quirks that can make getting a good reasonable path kind of tricky.
Well, I think that's like the difference between, just applying steep and shallow to anything and the true like art of like, okay, I want it to look like this. I want it to function like this. And yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's so what about work holding and tool holding? What did you decide on? What kind of decision process did you have to go through for that?
Yeah. So I am running a mix of different holders, but mostly shrink fit. And so essentially, I settled on shrink fit and ER32 kind of collet system. Well, and then there's also like a narrow collet system, SBL6 or something. It's a Technics product.
Oh, the one you tighten through the back of the holder?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it has a really narrow collet. I think it stops at like a 1/4 inch, and then you tighten it through like a drawbar in the back. And those are handy just from when you need to get into like really tight spots with a drill or a tap or something, but don't want to like shrink it because you're going to use it once. The actual holders, I think I have a mix of. I've got a bunch of Heimers, a bunch of Technics, a bunch of like random German ones because I got an eBay lot of like 40 different holders and a shrink fit machine. This guy was parting out a rotors that fell off a back of a truck, like quite
Oh,
literally the truck. Yeah. Yeah. I saw the eBay listing. Like, is this a real listing? I don't like it seems too good to be true. The price is really good. The tool holders look mostly in pretty good condition. And then I clicked on his profile and started looking, and he was parting out like there's a spindle chiller and there's like servo motors and like all the things of a machine except the machine itself. And so I started chatting with him like, yeah, there's a rigging accident and they dropped our mold making rotors literally off the truck. So
no.
we're fighting insurance and selling off all the stuff.
That's terrible.
Yeah, so I picked up that, and that's been nice because it's a lot of metric stuff, but it's a bunch of random German brands which I don't really know. I think a lot of them are like Diebold, Thermogrips, and they're convenient when I need like an odd metric or whatever. Tool holding has been kind of tricky. Oh, and a bunch of Heimer like ER32s just for random stuff. One thing that's been tough is that the work volumes of the med center are really tight, and so you end up finding yourself needing really long tools or tool holders to not, mash the pretty blocky spindle into the table. And that doesn't seem to be something that's made in the tool holder interface. So it's an HSK40E machine. And it seems like most manufacturers, the gauge length stops at like 3 inches generally. And like I would really like a 4 or 5 inch gauge length a lot of times,
Right.
which has been difficult. I was moaning about this on the Instamachinist Discord recently about how there's a lot more variety in the metric sizes. Like you can get 90 to 120 millimeter, but it stops at like 60 millimeters for Imperial. So we're still investigating that. I'm kind of like picking up onesies and twosies of different tool holders as I find them to see what works. And then work holding, well, work holding's been tough. It's been a challenge depending on the stuff I've been working on. So I do have a lot of stuff goes through a little KSC mini vise by, I think, Shunk white labels it from somebody else.
Yeah.
And it's been a great little vise. It's super cute, really compact. The jaws are interchangeable, which is really great. And it's just about the slimmest vise that I've been able to find as far as like Z height. So I've been using that a fair amount. I do have those like rando Chinese EDM style vices. I don't remember what they're, Xin Yang or something.
Oh, yeah.
And so I've got a couple of those, not because they're like particularly swell or anything, but I mean, they're actually not bad for the price for what they are, but they are pretty slim as well, pretty compact, which is really the main enemy that I'm working against is like Z height. And then I do have some dovetails, but I've not really used them much because I'm mostly doing like one-off sort of things. And by the time I decide to like, oh, I should dovetail this, I'm like, I'll just throw it in a vise and get it done one way or another. So I probably will go to dovetails at some point for more like production style stuff, but not at the moment. And then recently, I think Nick turned me on to this. There are like EDM slot holders that you can buy, and it's basically just like a slot or a round hole with like a grub screw that bites into the work. And I've been using those recently because they're very low profile as well, and like actually do a remarkably good job holding onto the stock. So I've been pretty happy with those. The only downside is that they're in the macro 54 size, so like the small pallet size, whereas my machine technically wants like the bigger macro magnum system. It's not a problem from like work holding or anything. It's just it doesn't work with the pallet changer if I were to ever get that.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Yeah, those EDM holders kind of remind me of a lathe stick holder, so like a manual lathe.
Yeah.
Just turned on inside, and it seems like they work really well for you. I mean,
yeah.
For something so simple, it feels the dichotomy of using that in a high precision 5-axis just feels kind of weird.
Yeah, it feels a little dirty.
Yeah.
When I always assume they wouldn't hold very well because it's just, I mean, it's literally just a grub screw kind of like stuck into the side. But everyone on Discord is like, oh, no, they're great. They do a good job. And I picked up a few. I'm like, oh, these are actually pretty great. The copper parts I was doing recently, those little combustion chamber things, I stuck them into a round, like 1-inch round holder front, and it was perfect because it gave support on all sides and the grub screw hold on to it. And I was pleasantly surprised how well that worked.
That's awesome. So speaking of your projects, you've done a couple now that are super impressive, especially for you kind of just diving into 5-axis. So were these projects that you already had in your mind before you had a 5-axis, or is this kind of like, oh, I've got a hammer, now I'm looking for nails kind of thing?
The second one. Like I've always wanted to do kind of like rockety based things, but it was like, oh, I don't have a lathe and there's no way I'm doing that on a 3-axis mill. So it was one of those things I kind of always just never thought about. And then once you get a 5-axis, you're like, oh yeah, there's like cool projects I can work on now that really take advantage of a 5-axis machine. So yeah, it's just one of those things that like once you get a new tool, you start thinking about like, okay, what can we use this for, and what kind of interesting, cool things. It is funny though, because everyone always says you mostly use a 5-axis for positional work, 3+2, and that is 100% correct. I use it maybe 80% of the time as a glorified like refixturing machine, and then 20% of the time as a lathe. And then very rarely have I actually used full simultaneous. So yeah, it's the way it goes.
yeah, for sure. So, I mean, what was the first big project? Was it the rover wheel? Because I think you've shown all of these off on your Instagram, right? I'm not spoiling anything.
No spoilers.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think the first big one was the rover wheel, which boy, I underestimated the work involved with that. So for folks that haven't seen it, I was working on a replica of the Curiosity Mars rover wheel because it's a really neat little piece of engineering, even though it's just a wheel. They machined it out of aluminum. It's like, I don't know, 3 or 4 feet or 2 or 3 feet in diameter, but it's only a millimeter thick. Or I think it might have even been less than a millimeter thick. So like super impressive engineering. I feel bad for the machinists that had to make the real ones because like that was probably really tough. But I saw, I'm like, I'm going to make one of these on my machine. I've got a fancy 5-axis now, and it was a learning experience for sure. It's right at the limit of the size of my machine, like work volume wise. And so as a first project, that was probably not the best idea to be like fighting against what I could do in the machine. And I don't know, it was a good crash course in like surfacing techniques, figuring out how to do good 3D surfacing, which toolpaths, work better or don't work well. So yeah, it was a good experience. But the original plan was I was going to make it for a video and then make more of them to like sell kind of as like a merchandise thing to go along with the video. And that quickly got nixed once I started looking at cycle times. So I'm like, oh man, I've spent like 7 hours working on this wheel. There's no way I can do this profitably.
Yeah, there was a ton of surfacing in that wheel. It was
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah, because I modeled it as realistically as I could to be a close replica. So there's lots of like little sharp corners, which you need tiny little tools for. And then the whole wheel actually has a very gentle, like, I don't know how to describe it, like a radius to it.
It's like a truncated football, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not just a cylinder, which means you can't use any of the easy rotary paths. It's like you're doing steep and shallows or parallels or whatever on all the different sections. And yeah, it was a ton of surfacing. And it was one of those things too. I learned that like, okay, well, I can get a really good surface with say like a 1/4 inch ball mill, but that's never going to reach into the little corners. But if I fill out those little corners with a 1/32 ball mill, now it doesn't look good with the place at the 1/4 inch, like the blend between it. So now I need to go back over that region with the small tool, and it all kind of exploded from there. So yeah,
Did you make a video about that, or is that still coming,
no,
or just kind of that one got the chopping block?
it might have gotten the chopping block. I might finish it at some point because I've got another one that's like half done at the moment. I think I'll probably downgrade it to just a video about the wheel and the engineering of it and stuff, and then just not try to make more of them to sell, which is fine. I learned my lesson there. But it is a really neat mechanism, and the hub that goes in the middle is made out of titanium, and it was like it has this cool little like spiral flexure thing, and it's a super cool mechanism. So I'd like to do a video on it at some point.
That's awesome. Speaking about selling things, your latest one, you made these combustion chambers. You're selling them now. Walk me through the process of that whole project. Where did you come up with it? Modeling it. There's a lot more into this project than just machining too, which I thought was very interesting. I saw the machining on either your Instagram or on the Insta Machinist, but then I didn't realize how much more was into it with like the wax fill and all of this stuff. So
Yeah.
walk me through that project.
Yeah. Honestly, I don't remember where I found it. It's one of those things that you just like run across a tidbit at some point and it kind of sticks in your brain. I'd seen somewhere that they had done electroplating or electroforming to make the outer shell on a variety of these different rocket engines. And it was one of those things that just kind of always stuck in my head. It's like, that's a really cool, kind of clever technique. It's a relatively low tech thing to do, but applied to this really high tech, like actual rocket engines. So it was one of the things that was always kind of in the back of my head. And then if I ever got a lathe, it's like, oh, maybe I could demonstrate this. So once I got the machine, I was looking around for interesting projects and I was in the mood for doing a machining project. So I kind of went on the crash course trying to find all the historical documents that you can. And NASA's great because a lot of their stuff is public record because it's NASA. So you can find a lot of the old white papers where they're talking about different techniques or, engineering trials for different things they've worked on. So there's a lot of information to dig up about how they actually did it.
There seemed to be a lot of footage too that you were able to use. Like that was so cool in your video, was you being able to cut back to NASA video explaining the whole process. I was like, this is awesome.
Yeah, there's a lot of well, technically all of the video that NASA produces is considered public domain. And you can even use it for like commercial purposes as long as there's a few disclaimers, but pretty much all their archive is free and public, which is pretty cool. So you can just like sift through it and find all these really like kind of cutesy or quaint old videos about the Saturn V rocket, or I found some really old ones talking about just like the very beginning when they're working on space flight and their little satellites they're putting up. And yeah, it was cool to kind of sift through all that and find fun little sound bites or video clips to stick in. But the process, one thing that appealed to me about it was that it was a mix of the machining with the non-machining, like you mentioned. So I thought that was really cool where they basically did this like complicated vacuum casting process. It's like a centrifugal vacuum casting of this very specific alloy that they developed. They only made like a certain number of these raw castings. They're basically big cylinders from what I understand. So the company made, I don't know, 50, 100, however they made, shipped them off to NASA and then just like shut down the process. Like they didn't make them anymore after that, which has led to problems recently because like the knowledge to make that alloy is kind of lost and they've had to like figure out how to do it, which is kind of funny.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And anyway, these raw castings went off and then they machined them and put the slots in them and then did that kind of like crazy wax process and plated over it. And just the whole thing just became enamored with. And so, well, in any case, reverse engineering the CAD stuff was not too hard because there's, diagrams of these rocket chambers online. So just like threw it in CAD, put a canvas on Fusion and kind of outlined it. I learned my lesson with this one as opposed to the NASA wheel or the Curiosity wheel, in that making the features a little more friendly to machine was probably a good idea. So it's still very small and had, small tools, but I tried to like simplify it and make a better, more machinable thing. And I wasn't originally planning to sell it, but I'd bought a couple feet of copper bar stock because I just wasn't sure how much I was going to need. And, you go through a couple iterations of this before you actually get a project working. And so I had leftover copper and like, let's just machine up a few more and see if anyone's interested in buying them. And a few folks did, which was cool. So
yeah. How was pricing something like that? I know we had talked, and I think you had talked on the Discord about it. I know, even for job shop work, that's kind of tough for me. I don't know, for a lot of people. I imagine, especially for something like a boutique rocket nozzle model, it can be exceptionally hard to price something like that.
Yeah, it was. I still feel kind of uncomfortable about it, like the price that we ended up at. So I had a price in my head, and it was basically like, how much money would I want to spend for something like this, which was like $50, $60, something like that, which didn't at all make sense from the machining time. These went pretty fast. Like once I got the cycle time dialed in, it was, I think, a total of like an hour and a half. So about an hour for the first op, which was all of 5 sides of it. And then I flipped it into a different fixture. And then that was like 10 minutes. So it was like a reasonably quick thing, but it's just me here. I don't have any automation. So I'm like, I can make 8 of these a day max if I'm like standing at the machine pretty consistently. So it needed to be a higher price. And then folks on Discord were like yelling at me that it was priced way too low. So we ended up at a much higher price, which, like I said, still makes me feel a little uncomfortable because I'm not a real machinist and like service finishes aren't perfect. There is little, cosmetic issues, which definitely concerned me a little bit when I sent them out. But I mean, they sold out over the weekend after I put them up. So I guess pricing was okay.
Yeah. I think it was totally fine. Like, I think that you priced it right where it needs to be for something like that, for sure.
It is interesting because like I was talking to someone else in more YouTube land. There's a discussion going on about like merchandise versus products. And it is interesting because like a product is something that people buy because they want the product and it's maybe influenced by a brand, but it's largely you're buying it for the thing. Whereas like merchandising is kind of a weird category where you're half buying it because you like want to support a person or you want to be like related to the brand in some way or like show off that you're part of a brand. Like I've bought shirts from creators just so I can like walk around and have a shirt from that creator and be like part of the in crowd. And so like merchandising is kind of unique in that the pricing is a little divorced from the utility because there's essentially no utility to the thing I sold. It was not even like a good desk paperweight because it's so small. It's like almost entirely useless other than being made out of copper. But like, it's also kind of cool. If one of the creators that I like made something like that, there's a pretty good chance I would consider buying it. So it is an interesting headspace to be in because it's kind of partially about the brand of the person or the organization and a kind of like a luxury good, but it's like a luxury good that doesn't actually do anything for you. And yeah, I don't know. It's strange.
Cool desk ornament. Like I think that it straddles that category. Like it's like, oh, I want to buy it because I saw the video. I don't know. It's like your friend buying something cool that's really esoteric, and your reaction is, "I want to buy one of those too."
Hmm.
Smarter Every Day, that he did that video on the roller-ons from
Hmm.
the AIM-9 missiles, and like if he started machining roller-on models, I would for sure buy one because they
Yeah,
were
it's
just
true.
it's both something cool that I wanted to play with, and I want to support the channel. So I think you priced it very well.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of that's the direction that I think I want to take things in the future as well. Because I have a Patreon, but I don't like talking about the Patreon because I don't know, I don't like asking people to like give me money so I can make videos on the internet. Like, I know it's a thing that people do and they're happy to do it. I support a bunch of people on Patreon, but for me personally, I like making something to give to people, like some kind of thing. Uh, and there is something neat about having like if you watch a video like the thing you could actually buy. I would like to maybe make stuff that is a little more affordable in the future or something that's maybe a little more mass producible. I've got a couple ideas around that, but I do think that is an interesting idea of a way to like fund the channel without having to just like ask for donations or be entirely reliant on sponsors, which is a whole conversation of itself.
So
So
speaking of that, actually, this latest video you announced, or part of it was that you are now on Brilliant
Nebula.
or Nebula. I'm sorry,
Yep.
that's your twin services, right?
I think so. There's Nebula, and then Curiosity Stream is kind of
That's what
like
I was thinking of.
is
Yeah.
a similar service, and then Brilliant and Skillshare are usually sponsors that go on those videos, so they get all kind of tangled up. But they're like learning services.
So sell me off video, sell me on Nebula, because so many of the YouTubers that I do watch have been joining it,
Hmm.
and I've been right on the edge of buying a subscription many times, but I don't know, like, how does it help you? Why did you choose to join up? Or, how does that whole partnership work? Because I think that it's like right on the fringe of a lot of our consciousness of what it actually is. And I'd
Hmm.
like to know more.
Yeah. So Nebula. Trying to think of the best way to phrase this. First of all, I'm new to Nebula in general, so this is perspective of a new person. I think it's still trying to get its name out there as to like what it really is. People that in Nebula really like it. I didn't really know what Nebula was before I joined. I mean, I kind of knew what it was. I thought it was more just a like an agency where you get they deal your sponsors and all that sort of stuff. But really, what Nebula is basically like a creator owned streaming platform. So it's they're like in the contract, all the different creators that join the platform are basically part owner of the platform. So it's very much in the interests of the platform to be doing what the creators want, and what the creators want is in the interest of the platform. So it's very kind of circular that way. Uh, from a creator side, it's really helpful because we get to see data about sponsorships and stuff, which is not something that is very standard in the industry. So a lot of people don't really know what's going on. But from like a viewer's perspective, there's kind of like the list of soft benefits and then the list of like really like tangible benefits. So from a tangible side, there's no ads. It's basically YouTube without advertisements. There are a number of like exclusive or behind the scenes videos that creators will put up that are kind of exclusive to Nebula, or a lot of times there'll be extra footage. So like Real Engineering did the Helion tour, and then on Nebula he's got more of the Helion tour that didn't make it into the YouTube video. And that's kind of like a common thing that YouTubers will, almost all of them will say, like, I have all this stuff, but it gets cut because YouTube has a very, you got to keep people hooked, and it needs to be a certain length. Even for long videos, you still need to cut a lot of stuff. So it's nice being able to have a place you can dump all that like extra interesting content that doesn't necessarily get onto the platform. Um, there's a bunch of other stuff that are kind of in development. There's like classes and podcasts and stuff like that. I haven't explored them too much myself, but they're there if you're interested in it. From kind of like a softer side, like it's probably the best way to support creators other than maybe directly giving them money through something like Patreon. Because the way the arrangement works is that the folks that are on Nebula get a percentage of your subscription based on how much you watch their channel. So like if you're paying $5 a month or $3 a month, whatever it is, and you spend half of your time on the site watching my videos, then I get half of your subscription price basically. But it's multiplied out by the whole platform. So I get, a percentage of the total watch time divided by like the amount of revenue that the platform gets. So has a potential to bring in a lot more money than just like ads on YouTube or, sometime in some cases more than if you're just giving it directly on Patreon, because it's a percentage of total watch time across the whole platform. And so it's a little decoupled from how much money you yourself are paying in subscription fees.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Well, it sounds like it's much more of a true meritocracy versus who can scam the algorithm the best,
Yeah, exactly. And that's one reason why people seem to like it, is that there's no algorithm. It's all chronological. So you just see the things as they show up. And most people don't really go to the homepage, from what I understand. They just go to like their creators that they enjoy watching on the channels on the various pages. And there's less worry about like demonetization. Like my channel doesn't have to worry about that. I don't do anything that's too risque because it's material science and machining. But some channels, have to worry about being demonetized, about if they're talking about war crimes or whatever. That's something that YouTube might not be happy putting sponsors next to.
Right.
So for those kinds of creators, it can be really helpful for them.
That's great. I'll definitely have to look more into it then, because that sounds well worth it. It's like I said, more and more of the creators I watch have been saying that they're on it now. And I'm like, okay, this might be the time. And it doesn't seem like it's exceptionally expensive, especially compared to some other streaming services.
Yeah, I think it's like $25 a year. I think if you like sign up through one of the creator codes, or I don't know, like $35 if you don't. Like it's pretty cheap for what it is. I mean, we'll see. Time will tell. One thing that I do like about it from just my perspective is that they really seem to like care about the creators. That's not to say YouTube doesn't. Like I think YouTube's actually done a really good job of taking care of creators and giving out a good amount of money. They could be a lot stingier than they are, but just the nature of the platform is that they don't care as much about any particular creator because it's a giant platform. Whereas like Nebula is, by kind of definition, the way it's set up, much more interested in taking care of the folks that are part of the platform. So
totally. So did they reach out to you?
No, it was actually, it's kind of funny. So I went on Twitter and was just asking if anyone had like an agency or an agent to deal with sponsorships, because I was at a certain life point where I was trying to decide, do I like throw myself full time into job shop work and like give up the YouTube life, or do I like double down on YouTube, or do I quit it all and go make a startup or whatever? So I was kind of at this like junction of a few different options. And so I reached out to see if anyone had an agent that could deal with sponsorships, because I hadn't up to that point, and I just didn't want to, because it's such a nightmare dealing with YouTube sponsorships, because they have all the information and you have none of it. And so you just know you're getting totally reamed, but you don't know how badly they're like taking advantage of you. And so I wanted someone to just do it for me. And long story short, I got connected through a couple different folks and got hooked up with Nebula. But they basically work on like a referral mechanism. So they mostly only pick up folks that have been referred by other people that are already on the platform, just to limit it, and for no particular reason other they trust their creators, and it's still pretty small, so they don't want to just like let everyone in.
Right. Yeah, totally. Well, let's talk about also some other gadgetry or machinery you've gotten. You got your high vacuum chamber.
Yeah.
Why? How? All of that stuff.
Oh, speaking of poor life choices.
I didn't mean to touch a sore subject.
No. That's you could describe a lot of stuff on the channel as poor life choices, poor career choices. Yeah, I don't know. I've always been interested in high vac stuff. It's just like a really interesting field. There's cool techniques that use or need high vacuum, and building a high vacuum chamber is kind of like this cool high-tech Lego kit, because there's a lot of like really standardized parts, and you can kind of Lego them into all kinds of different configurations and make whatever monstrosity you want to work with. So it was one of those things where there's a couple projects I wanted to do at the time, and I maybe will still do, that needed a high vacuum chamber. So I'm like, let's just build a high vacuum chamber. And it's, for better or worse, you can find a lot of high vac gear on eBay for moderate prices. Like it's pretty cheap, because it's one of those things, there's no one out there buying it other than like weird people that have YouTube channels or like universities.
Right.
So, and even like a lot of universities aren't allowed to buy used off eBay. And so a lot of this stuff you can get for pretty good pricing, although you do have to be careful, because some of it can be like contaminated with some pretty terrible chemicals. So anyone listening, like, disclaimer, don't just go buy, there's like arsenic and other bad metals. Yeah. But yes, I don't know. I saw a good deal for a couple different parts. I'd been accumulating other components for a while, and time was right to fully assemble it. And I have it. I haven't actually used it for much so far. I think at the time I was in a satellite micro thruster kick. So I was like, I'm going to make a little like CubeSat micro thruster, and I can demo it inside the vacuum chamber. And I think that was what the impetus for it was at the time. I'm not sure that ever happened, but
But it's cool you have it now, and if you get that bug again,
yeah,
right back to it.
Yep.
That's great. Some questions from listeners. K-Trends asked, how do you go about choosing your next project or video to work on when you can seemingly make or do pretty much anything?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's both easy and really tough. And it's something I've been personally working on to do better about it. Most of my projects are kind of discovered accidentally while I'm researching a different project. So a lot of times I'll be working on something where I've got like a process or a technique in mind. So I'm doing a lot of research about it. And then you'll just stumble across cool things just because it's the nature of it. Reading like papers or white papers from NASA, whatever, you see a thing, you're like, oh, that sounds cool. And then you go look it up, and, it's like Wikipedia stumbling, but academic version. So a lot of stuff just comes from that. So I have a notebook full of just neat things. From there, it's usually trying to figure out which of those neat things are actually doable in like a shop environment. A pretty well kitted out shop at this point, but they're still pretty limited compared to like an actual university. So that's kind of the first criteria, is like, is this doable? Is this doable in any reasonable amount of time? Am I going to spend 3 months working on this? And then more recently, I've been trying to factor in how mainstream appeal is it? Because that's something that I've not done a great job of in the past. And this is segueing into like YouTube land, but the way it was described to me is there's like a Venn diagram of your interests. There's a like a circle of the audience interests, like the audience being the nebulous masses of the world. And then you need to find that slice that intersects pretty well. And I've traditionally skewed more into my interests, which has been a lot of fun, but doesn't always necessarily equate to like super compelling videos for a large audience.
So this might be a good segue into, you had a microscope channel and then brought that into Breaking Taps. What was that decision making process like? What made you split it off, and then what made you bring it back in?
Yeah. Well, so the traditional advice is to not have too different of content on a channel. And so the way I was doing those videos, like the subject matter wasn't too different, because it was like microscope stuff. It was a lot of scanning electron microscope images of, I don't know, like bugs and microchips and stuff like that. But the delivery was very different. Like, it was narrated, and the narration was very different from how I normally do videos. So it just felt like a different audience effectively. So the standard advice is like, put it on a different channel, because you don't want your audiences mixing. It didn't take off nearly as well as I'd hoped. And the original plan for that series was, it was something that I thought I could scale better. So the projects I work on here, you spend a month working on a single project and you get one video out of it. And I was trying to like figure out like, okay, how can I scale this idea of like YouTube being a business? And one of the ways is making videos that are easier to produce by being able to like outsource parts of it. So in my head, I was thinking like, okay, well, eventually I could hire like a writer to make the script, and I can have an editor piece together these microscope images, because that would be something that pretty much anyone can do. And then I can just do the narration, and we can knock these videos out in a more scalable manner, slap some sponsors on it, and I've got myself like a business. It didn't quite pan out that way. There's reasons, I'm sure, but I ultimately just decided it wasn't working, and I didn't think it was really something I wanted to spend more time on. And so that's why I kind of like rolled it back into the main channel, knowing that they probably wouldn't do well there either, but at least they would get some like residual views and money over time.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
totally.
So that was just kind of failed experiment.
Yeah, they're fun to watch, but like you said, they are just slightly different enough from your normal stuff that it makes sense that you wanted to try your own channel for them. Josh at NH Micro asked, if money was no object, in which niche that you've covered would you spend your time?
If money was no object, I would probably spend like the rest of my life working like the microfab stuff, because I find it really, really interesting. So for folks, like when I say microfab, I mean like photolithography and silicon wafer etching and all like microchip sort of construction. It's just a fascinating field, and I could spend a lot of money on it if I wanted to. So I'd build out, like proper clean room and get all the associated equipment. And it's one of those things too, like you can pick up a lot of used equipment for shockingly cheap. It's still very expensive, but you see something it's maybe $10,000, but it was originally like $1 million when it was made in 1982. And so you look at it, you're like, man, this is a killer deal, even though it's still very expensive to have in a shop. And it's a very specific piece of equipment. But one thing that I love about that field, which I think is really interesting and not really explored, is that like today we have multi-billion-dollar fabs and they're churning out like literally billions of microchips a year, and it's a super hyper optimized high performance industry. And we got there through a series of decisions that always optimize, like scaling or profitability or like a bunch of different axes, which all make total sense for a business. And so we have a very specific architecture and way of manufacturing these chips using specific materials because of all those decisions. But at like each fork in the road for the last 30, 40 years, there's been a lot of options that were kind of discarded because maybe they weren't quite as high performance, or, it's a slower process, or there's a bunch of different reasons. But there's still like really cool techniques that if you didn't care about making billions of chips and you just want to make 1,000 chips a year, like that could be a really interesting avenue to explore. And so kind of like going back down the tech tree almost and exploring one of the side branches, I think there's a lot of like really interesting value there, even with knowing that you're not shooting for the same end goal. So that's something that I've always thought was a really cool idea. And if I had lots of money and time, like that's what I would probably spend my time doing. And exploring, you can go look at like analog computers instead of like digital computers, or take different architectures, lots of really cool routes you could take instead. It's kind of funny, actually. There's a place south of me, I don't know, it's like 3 hours south of me, it's like a $10 million clean room research lab that's up for rent. And it's a very reasonable rent. It's only like a couple of $1,000s a month. Like I have no way to justify it, but I would love to just move down there and rent this like enormous giant facility and work in a clean room. And it'd be so cool. But
Totally.
yeah.
Well, it's only tangentially applies, but I thought your video on all the micro mechanisms inside your phone, like the gyro and all of that, I thought that was fantastic. I'd never seen someone explain those chips so well. Like, I think, we all have a phone in our pocket, and to not know kind of the basis of like, why does my screen go sideways when I turn the phone sideways? I thought that was super cool and very, blowing everything up and 3D printing it. I thought was such a great way to explain it all. So, I'm personally hoping you do more stuff like that so that I can kind of understand more of the micro stuff that I don't understand.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And yeah, that's actually that's kind of my focus moving forward, is in my head, like trying to more mainstreamify the channel. Like people really resonated with those 3D printed models, which I totally get. Like I'm a very physical, tactile person too. So like a lot of those mechanisms I actually didn't fully understand until I'd printed it out, and then you kind of wiggle it. You're like, oh, okay, this is how the thing moves, right? You just don't really get a sense of that until you have it in your hands. So that's definitely something I'm trying to focus on moving forward, is more like manufactured models, whether it's like machined or 3D printed, to like explain particular topics, because it's just, I don't know, I think it's easier for folks to understand.
It reminded me a lot of the way Adam does his paper models for his videos.
Yeah.
And explains, I think that big, blocky, colorful models or paper models, I don't know what it is, what they tap into, but they explain complex subjects so well, and they stick so well. Like I have images in my head of, what these gyros now look like, despite them being almost impossible to see.
Right. Yeah. I feel like it's probably something like, to be able to make a model of it, you yourself have to understand it pretty well. And then like once you've made it, you have to simplify different aspects of it so you can kind of like remove some of the complexity. Like the paper models that Adam shows, like because the nature of it being 2D, I feel like that really helps you understand it, because it's simplified. So you're just looking at the essence of the concept rather than, all the other complexities that happen in the real world. Really, I know, it really helps me understand how things work as well.
Awesome. Let's see. Tux Garage asked, how do you keep from losing tiny parts? He said, very impressive thruster parts.
Well, I'm a very disorganized person. like very disorganized. People always ask for shop tours, and I never do a shop tour because my shop is a disaster. So I've not lost any customer parts yet, but it can be challenging sometimes to keep everything straight on my workbench. I've been using a lot of 3D printing, to be honest, for some for like in process parts, but also for a lot of packaging. So those thruster parts in particular, they're made out of like sintered glass. So it's basically like foamy glass material that it's really soft. You can like scrape it with a scalpel and it just kind of like flakes apart. And it has these very delicate little tips. So I was trying to figure out how to like mail these to the customer, and there's not a great way to hold on to them. And so I did a lot of kind of creative 3D printing, which was a really handy way to make custom packaging for small, delicate parts to ship out. So
Yeah, I did the same recently. I had some very tiny brass parts that I was like, I don't want to put them in a bag together because they might scratch, and they have very sharp edges. And so, yeah, I did the same thing. I printed basically a jig that held them all, and then I could just put tape over the whole thing. And I was like, all right, they're safe.
It's done. Yep.
But yeah, tiny parts are hard. We just made some very tiny Delrin parts maybe a week ago, and I was doing some of the deburring, and then Brad was finishing it up under the microscope, and one of them, he just goes, I don't know what happened to it, man. I grabbed it with the tweezers, and it just pinged off of something. Like I had made I think 3 or 4 extra of every single part number in that order, because I was like, we're bound to lose or crush or do something to one, but
it's gonna happen. Yeah.
It's tough. It's really tough.
Well, a lot of the non-machining stuff I deal with is very small. So like the atomic force microscope has a super, super tiny tip on it. And if you kind of like look at it sideways, it'll break on you, and it's a very expensive tip. So like dealing with that's always very stressful. And I did a video about turning the scanning electron microscope into like a transmission electron microscope, and I don't need to get into it, but one of the things I used was like a calibration grid to check if it was working or not. And this thing was, I don't know, I think it's like 200 nanometers thick. So it's very, very thin, because it's essentially like a small sheet of plastic that's transparent to electrons. So it's super, super thin, and it's got like metal particles on top of it. And the label says in big, like, do not turn upside down, you'll ruin it because it'll like scratch the stuff. I pull it out, immediately it shoots off my tweezers and like flies across the room and lands upside down. I'm like, well, that was like $200 down the drain. This is great. You look at it under the microscope, you're like, yep, that is definitely ruined. Yeah, it's fun.
Nothing
for anyone that doesn't know,
feel...
it's okay.
I was just going to say, nothing makes me feel more like a big bumbling idiot, like tiny parts. I feel like I have, fairly dexterous fingers. And then, you give me like a millimeter or smaller part. I'm like, wow, I am just, nope, have no control over my hands anymore.
Yeah. No, I 100% know what you mean. I did learn that like pneumatic, I don't even know what you call them, like pneumatic tweezers almost. Think like a little suction cup that like the pen, you like push a button and it like pulls a vacuum, so you can like stick it onto flat things and then push the button and it'll like suck it up onto the suction cup, and then you can use that to transfer around. Those are really handy. They're used by like microscope people or wafer people a lot. And then also tweezers that are self-closing are super handy as well. So I now have a bunch of different types of like finely honed self-closing tweezers, so you can just like grab it and then let go and it's holding on to it, which is nice.
I probably need to get some of those. Yeah. Brad was using, I have some Delrin tipped watchmaker tweezers, but even then, the nice thing with the Delrin tips is that they don't scratch and they don't damage, but the bad thing is that they flex enough that you can just kind of like squeeze a part out of it by accident.
Yeah, so. Just kind of squirts across the room.
Yeah. No, I need to kind of expand my tiny part handling tool kit, I think, for sure. Well, that brings me on to shop news and new things. Anything new in your world? Anything you're planning on adding shortly or anything like that?
Oh, I recently got some tumblers, which are cool. I don't have any strong opinions about them yet because I just got them like last week or 2 weeks ago. But they're those little centrifugal kind of disc tumblers. Oh, sorry.
Are they the Avalon ones? Or
yeah, it's the Avalon ones. So I got a wet and a dry. I was previously just using, can you hear the F-35s?
Yeah.
Should I wait for a sec?
No. Keep going. It'll be fine.
So I was originally using just the cheap, crappy, vibratory Harbor Freight tumblers. And those were taking forever and also not doing a very good job. So I picked up the Avalons. They're really nice, to be honest. Like I was kind of expecting cheap import stuff, and they're made in Poland. It's like a really nice welded steel frame. The tumbler itself is like really high quality, and so far anyway, they seem great. I haven't used the wet one yet. I've only been using the dry one with like walnut media, but it does a great job. Things come out looking just beautiful. So can definitely
Yeah,
recommend those.
I've been considering getting the smaller one for some of our parts because I really am not a giant fan, at least when you're sending like precision parts of like throwing them in a tumbler. It's like I don't want to
Yeah.
send rounded corners and stuff, but the Avalon seem to do a really good job of kind of keeping sharper corners
hmm
sharp but deburred and polishing parts rather than leaving just like, generic tumble finish on them.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's an area that I need to spend more time because I don't know a ton about finishing. Like I've mostly just relied on trying to get a really good finish off the mill and that's it. But sometimes I don't want just like a mill finish. But the few times I've tried to do a more aggressive tumbling, it's just come out looking really terrible, like just really banged up and gross. And it's not that nice silky vapor hone looking finish. It's just like garbage tumble finish. So I'm hoping these will help, although I think I need to spend some time looking at media and figuring out, trying different things. I think that's it for new things. I'm considering a big change up in the shop in general. Like I'm getting rid of the Avid because I don't use it anymore and it's just taking up a lot of space. Uh, and I'm probably going to sell the Haas, the office mill, and I'm not sure what I want to replace it with yet. So we'll see. But I don't know. I was just thinking about it, and it sort of serves the same purpose as the Med Center in that it's like a micro machining system. I basically use it as a support mill now for like larger things, but it's a very small machine, so it doesn't actually do that large of things. So it's not great from like a stock prep perspective or big fixture plates or anything like that. So my mind's kind of in like I could sell it and then pick up something even like a mini mill would be fine, or a small VM series sort of machine, whether it's actually from Haas or not, something like that, just like a standard 3-axis, whatever. So that's one route I'm thinking. Uh, the other route is instead of buying a support mill, I could just throw that into the APC for the Med Center because that seems like that would help me a lot. So I can keep working on videos while also making parts because like right now they're kind of at odds with each other, making parts or making videos. Whereas if I had some type of automation, could just like hit the button and walk away. I know there's more to it than that, but it would at least automate things a little more. But I haven't quite convinced myself that's the right choice because the work volumes on the Med Center are just so tight in certain areas that it might not be the best way to go. So I'm not sure.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it would make something like those rover wheels maybe a little bit more attainable, like, yeah,
Yeah.
they're 5-hour runtime or 4-hour runtime, but if it's overnight, you can get a handful of them done every night and
Yeah, exactly.
not worry about it. Yeah. Well, that brings me to the first of two questions that I ask every guest every week. The first of which is, what did you research this week? Doesn't have to be machining related, just what's been popping up in your browser. I'm sure you have some pretty cool stuff that you've been looking into.
Well, I think between my laptop and my desktop, I've got like 6 browser windows with like 50 tabs each. So I'm a chronic tab hoarder.
Oh man, all of the RAM. All
yeah.
of the RAM.
Yeah, exactly. Chrome recently did an update where they're like, we save memory by disabling tabs. I'm like, yes, thank you. I need this. I think recently I've been doing a lot of research into machines, like I just mentioned, just different kinds of machines and varieties and stuff. But for the channel, I've been diving into, well, if you follow me on Instagram and watched any of my stories recently, I've been doing a lot of like jet turbine parts. So that is for a video I'm working on. It's this like, it's a research and development concept jet that NASA put together. I don't know, like 2006 or something. It's basically an inside out jet engine. So they call it an exoskeletal jet. And so if you're familiar with like jet architecture, you've essentially got the stators, which don't move around the outside of it, and all the vanes kind of like point inwards. And then the rotor, the part that actually does move, is on a central shaft that runs in the middle, and then it spins. So the exoskeletal jet is inverted. So the stator is in the middle and it doesn't move. So all the vanes kind of point out. And then the rotating part is on the outside with all the vanes pointing in. So it's this effectively entirely the same mechanics, just swapped rotor and stator. And so the benefit of it is that the traditional jet engines, it's like really hot, right? Because it's a jet engine. So you need all these super alloys and stuff, but they're under huge tensile stress because the rotor is spinning at crazy high velocity. And so like these metals are being pulled in tensile by a really high forces in really extreme conditions. And so by switching it, you put the blades are now in compression because they're being pushed outward as it spins. And you can start to use like ceramics and other kind of highly technical materials that don't have good tensile properties, but have really good compressive properties. And so that's the idea, is like you could replace all the Inconel and Monels and all that sort of stuff with, aluminum nitride or silicon nitride, that sort of thing.
Oh, how cool. So
Yeah.
how long does a process like this take for a video? Like, when did you start this project
Hmm.
and when do you think you'll be close to done?
Well, it is due next week.
Oh,
So
okay.
it better be done next week. Yeah, that's a good question. So I've recently given myself like a monthly budget, basically, where I have a month to work on a project. And that includes everything from like conceptualizing it to whatever I need to make or do for the project, up through filming, editing, publishing. So generally, I try to give myself like 3 weeks to make or do the thing, and then about a week to film and edit it. So for this jet engine, for example, I need to really finish all the parts by this Friday, and then spend next week filming it, writing the script for it, doing all the editing, and getting it online. I'll probably miss that deadline if I'm being honest with myself, but we're aiming for that. But yeah, it's part of my kind of New Year's resolution, is trying to like stick to a better schedule. And now that I've been taking on some sponsors, it's a little more important that I actually hit schedules rather
Right.
than. But before, like when I was less diligent about it, I'd do something for a week and then it wouldn't work out. I'm like, oh, okay, well, on to the next one. And you do that a couple times, and you realize it's been 2-3 months before you put out a video, which is not great if you're like relying on the revenue from that video to pay
Right.
rent.
So does that
So
mean that you're double or triple tracking ideas then? Like, are you already now thinking about your next two ideas so that when next month hits, you can kind of hit the ground running?
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I've got the way I've kind of got it set up right now is there's the planned idea. So I've kind of got a safe option for the next couple months where it's a project that I've worked on in the past or I have a pretty good idea I can do. And then I leave myself some wiggle room if I want to change it. So actually for this month, it was supposed to be a metal 3D printing video, which I've kind of done in the past. There's some stuff on my Instagram about it. So I have a pretty good idea that I could finish it and get it done. But then when I was working on the rocket combustion chamber video last month, I ran into this exoskeletal jet and I was like, that is so cool. And so that kind of like led me down that rabbit hole. And I decided to bump the next one down the line. And I was pretty confident I could get it done in a month. That might have been a little ambitious now that I've actually spent the last like 3 weeks machining these parts. But yes, I kind of have like a set of things that I could work on. There's a whiteboard behind me with a bunch of like random ideas and stuff in various states. So
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, yeah, the jet is none of them are trivial parts. Like I
no.
think you shared kind of half an assembly a couple days ago, and just
Yeah.
seeing all of the different little things you've had to make. It's like, oof, yeah, that's a lot
Yeah.
of work.
It was rough. Yeah. Well, at first, when I'm like, okay, well, it'll be hard for the first one, but then I'll have the tool paths and I can just, it's a jet engine. They're all stators and rotors and vanes and stuff. It's all the same, right? And it kind of was, but each successive stage in the jet, like the geometry was just a little bit different. So I ended up having to tweak things just a little bit, or you run it and realize like the surface finish is garbage on this one tool path. So like the next one. So yeah, it's been a little more work than I expected. And I've really had to, I'm not really a perfectionist kind of person. Like I'm actually pretty sloppy when it comes to things, but I want my videos to look cool. So I've had to stop myself a few times from remaking parts because they're like, it came out, it's fine, no one's gonna notice, but like I can see that that's really bad finish on like a corner there or whatever. So I've had to be like, no, it's fine. Don't get too precious about this. Just get it done.
How many total parts are in that model?
I think there's 21 or 22 different parts. So
Oof.
there's like 10 there's like 8 stators and 8 rotors, and then there's a couple like bearing parts and a fan up front, and then the housing, which I really hope works. I'm going to make the housing out of acrylic, and I'm hoping I can make it clear enough that you can actually see what's going on, because that's pretty critical to everything, which I'm of course leaving to last. But the good thing is, so it's a non-functional demo. Like it'll spin, but it's not an actual jet engine. So I've been pretty loose about, there's parts I'm just gonna like super glue together and it's fine, and stuff like that, hide with the magic of editing. But
Totally. Well, that's great. Well, that brings me to the other question, which is what are the things you're working on to be a better person, leader, whatever, what have you? None of us are perfect. We're all working on stuff. What's yours this month?
yeah, so excuse me. I've been working, trying very hard to declutter and organize my shop. I'm very much, I've accumulated a lot of stuff in the name of the channel. And it's easy to like convince yourself, like, yeah, I need this piece of equipment off eBay for reasonably priced because I'll use it in a video. Right. And sometimes that works out. And sometimes you get it. And by the time it shows up, you're on to the next project anyway. And so it just sits on a shelf. So I have probably too many esoteric science equipments that I've got off eBay, which I really just need to get rid of. They're not doing any good. They're taking up shop space. And just in general, there's very much that sense of like, oh, I can use this component or this pump or this motor, right? So you've got the boxes full of stuff, which some of it you'll use. And the nature of running the kind of channel that I do is that some of it does actually get used, but that is a really seductive path to go down and ends up just like becoming, I don't know, pathological at some point.
Right.
So,
Yeah. It's like the box of cables we all have. Like the second you use one, you're like, well, it's all worth it. Clearly, I should keep hoarding these.
Yep. Yeah. So this is the summer of purging, getting rid of machinery I'm not using, equipment, getting rid of the office mill, stuff like that. Trying to like downsize and focus my life and the shop a little bit better. And then as part of that, at home, I have some equal messes to clean up because the stuff was in my garage originally, and then I moved up to the murder barn, and then pretty shortly after moved from the murder barn down to here, there's kind of just like this trail of destruction that I've left, which I've never quite gotten back around to fixing. And my wife's been very accommodating, but I need to like get it sorted now that things have settled down a little bit more. So that's a focus for the summer, is trying to get my life under control in that regards.
Awesome. So breaking taps, yard sale.
Yeah, exactly. If anyone wants weird science equipment or like vacuum ionization gauges, hit me up.
Well, Zach, thank you so much for coming back on the show. It's been great to check up and hear all about the new machinery and stuff, and I can't wait to see what's next.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you to all the Patreon members who make this show possible, and thank you all for listening. I'll be back next week.